contemporary West Africa. It's a difficult architectural genre to define. It doesn't belong to any genre. It's surprising, but it's also telling us about how we're dealing with our history and how we're dealing with the past. So that's why I think it's really important that it should be preserved. I will show you some of the pictures, which are the interconnections, because as I mentioned at the beginning, one of the first person that established this link between West Africa and Brazil was Pierre Verger. He lived in, he traveled in Benin. He lived in Benin, and he was and then he went to Brazil. He has there is still a foundation in Brazil, Salvador, called the Foundation Pierre Verger, where actually that I went and I visited, where actually you have most of his work on Afro Brazilian architecture. So a lot of his of the writing on Afro Brazilian architecture are coming from architects, yes, but are also coming were started by Pierre Verger, because he wanted to show the connection. And in his book, he shows the connections by because he was a photographer. So you have the Blanco house here in Lagos, a house in Recife. In Nigeria, Agha, and in Brazil, Acarajé, which is insane. Here, like what has been carried on the tradition, because I'm talking about the architecture because it's the most visible, but also tradition from Brazil have been carried on there. The language, but also traditions. And here is a passport, actually. It's like, it allows one of the returnees, if they were carrying a Brazilian passport, to allow them to travel to West Africa. So there is a clear connection that has been established between those two parts of the world, and it's really interesting because when we talk about transatlantic history, we tend to think about social triangular between Europe and Africa, Europe, and the Americas. But there were clearly cultural connections. There were clearly linked. In Nigeria, it was 2012. In an exhibition where the members of the Afro Brazilian community sent letters to try to trace their relatives in Brazil, because they still have relatives there. So there is a whole initiative. You can still do some artists that are still talking about this presence. So I found this history fascinating. I think I would advocate for preservation of this architecture because it's really important. In Benin, they try for the architecture to be recognized as a World Heritage, but they have never been successful. And I will question why. We'll discuss later. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, I would like to thank Alinta, who I've known for years, and it was just absolutely fascinating that somebody who is not of Nigerian descent could actually tell me my own history without actually, with a lot of passion. I'm third generation Brazilian descendant. My great-grandmother was from Salvador Bahia. They went back to Porto Novo and then settled in Lagos. So my mother was born in Lagos, and my great-grandmother, so it's sort of like that generation where they actually lived and grew up in the Brazilian quarters. So that is my own history that I grew up with. I chose not to research Nigeria when I was writing my doctoral thesis. I decided to work on Francophone West Africa. So my PhD thesis is actually looking at Francophone West Africa, which is why I can appreciate Republic du Benin. I work on Senegal, and part of Senegal as well has the slave roots called Gorée. Most of you would also know Gorée Island. It's actually very well preserved as well. So I'm going to focus really, because Alinta, thank you so much for emphasizing preservation. So what I would like to ask you again is, we kind of looked at this point where you said there was this big exodus, mass exodus of artists and artisans who went back to Lagos and started building grand houses. So absolutely, and the presence is still there. We know that that's a symbol of their cultural identity. So what I want to know, or what we would really like for you to elaborate, is when did we start seeing a decline? Because we kind of saw the rise, and all of a sudden, there just seemed to be this, all of a sudden, this silence of the Brazilian. I mean, the buildings are still there, but what created this? Yeah.
I mean, we have different art historians give different ways. So if we talk about the Aguda, first we have to understand that it's linked with the Aguda community. So by 1930, they were not as prominent as they used to be because of the start of colonization. So with the influence of the British, of the French, so they became less important, less prominent. And also, so that's the main reason is the British and the French coming, so imposing their architecture, developing buildings, the cities, so their presence they were less important, they had less say. So it's, I would say that from 1950, so 1930, the decline of the Aguda community, 1950s, that's where they start to notice a decline in the genre.
In the genre as well, okay. So back again, we see the hegemony, where we say a British cultural hegemony in Lagos, especially. So that is the beginning of where we know that the kind of architectural style we start seeing in Lagos. So for those of us who grew up in Nigeria, we see the colonial, so we started calling it colonial buildings. And we could see now that picture of the sideline of the Aguda communities in Lagos as well. The French have a way of, back again to Porto Novo, back to Republic du Benin, where all of a sudden you're seeing more emphasis on preservation. So could you also elaborate the difference between the British colonial or the British influence or the attitude towards preservation, where we could see on one side of Francophone West Africa there is a need to preserve buildings, while on the Anglo side, which is the Nigerian side, the decline in trying to preserve, whether it was Brazilian or, could you elaborate?
I think there is probably an influence of the French conception of of cultural heritage. So that's why you have I think it's the only one is in Benin, is the EPA, l'École du Patrimoine Africain, so the School of African Heritage.
Sorry, was that French initiated as well?
No, it was from Benin. It was an initiative from Benin. But what I'm saying is like there is probably an influence of what's been done in France in Benin. Also, I do think that the fact that is, as I mentioned, that is a bit more preserved in Benin is due to the fact that we are also looking at, for example, cities like Porto Novo and Ouidah, which are touristic cities. They are not they are cities that people would visit in terms of to look at Ouidah, the Vodun culture, but also it's part of the slave trade route. So there is a UNESCO initiative. So obviously there is no initiative from the state necessarily to preserve those houses, but because they know that there will be people coming as part of the slave trade project, as part of the Ouidah festival. So the Afro Brazilian that own the houses, they will actually organize a tour. So you have a tour from the city, like a tour of Afro Brazilian houses. There was I didn't go there, I couldn't, but I've been in touch, I've been in Skype with a guide from Porto Novo. So those are the initiatives because they are historical cities. And I will say that also Benin has always had this reputation of intellectuals in Africa. So I think there's always been this need for culture.
So for culture. Yes, that is quite interesting because we also know that it was not until recently that the Nigerian government decided to put history back into the school curriculum. I, as a researcher, again, understand that the attitude towards history has always also been a way of repressing memory as well. So when we say you have official memory and you have the national memory, so I'm going to go back because we had this conversation, which I think would also be very important for you, because that was not part of the presentation, but I think it would also be great to understand what happened during the time of after the independence. In 1960, as we know, the French left Africa. The majority of the African countries were granted independence. The British also left. 1960 was a key date at the time of colonialism, at the end of colonization. A lot of the countries also wanted to start creating what we call a national discourse, where they wanted to also have a sense of national unity. Could you elaborate what happened to the Aguda community or the Afro Brazilian community at that time when the national history of Nigeria was being created?
So my question is that it doesn't fit into a national discourse, because when we look at newly independent states, and I was doing that because I was comparing to research I did about the Mali, the music from Mali, coming from the griot, the jelly, and that was what's been put forward by the government, because it corresponds to the Malinka ethnic, to the history of Sunjata. So there was a direct need to see we are descendants of Sunjata Keita. This is the Empire of Mali. There is this affiliation, and so in that respect, some of the community, for example, of Mali have been in terms of music, like the tribe, have been left. So what was put forward was more the music coming from the Mali, Bambara, the Bambana. And so I was thinking about that in terms of the Aguda question, the fact that because they don't fit into the national discourse, meaning that, for example, there's been preservation of, think about Oshogbo in Nigeria, which been put forward, because it fit into this ancestry national discourse, but the Aguda doesn't fit into it, because they are seen as foreigners. They are seen as coming from abroad. So they are not fitting into a national discourse because you want unity. So you want to. So that's a question. That is a question.
Yeah, that could be because of course being of a Gouda descent as well, I have to usually tell people there was actually a Brazilian heritage in Lagos. Once you're outside Lagos, that history becomes questionable. People tell you you're making it up. They tell you you're lying. How can you be from Brazil? Where is that history? So that in itself was quite difficult, actually growing up in Nigeria, where we had to suppress the history as well. Or the only people who actually knew the history were those people who grew up in the community. So my mother's family and cousins, or people who had Brazilian sounding names, were actually, yes?
Oh, I didn't want to
Okay.
interrupt you.
Oh, sorry?
But I didn't want to interrupt you, but
All right,
I
okay,
have a
because we would
question.
have the,
Yeah.
yeah, and so also another problem was the intermarriage as well. Because once people start intermarrying, especially on the mother's side, and remember women carry the history as well, we're the storytellers. My own son is actually going to be, he's in great trouble because his own father is from the Sierra Leonean. So he's of Saro, the Sierra Leoneans who came from Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, into Lagos. So they're the Saro, and the story is a different story entirely. So you have the Sierra Leonean story, you have the Aguda story. What we also found out is why the Saro story actually is more preserved in Lagos. It's because when the Sierra Leoneans came back, they came through Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, back into Lagos, into Freetown and into Lagos. They came with English, which is a language which the British colony, the colonizers were already had. So they could have that conversation. So in terms of school and education and trade, the British government were actually quite happy to go and speak with the Saros. So the Sierra Leoneans started rising up, and that also had an impact on the Brazilians, because they came with Yoruba and Portuguese. So one thing the Sierra Leoneans, the Brazilians had to do was quickly either intermarry. We're still doing it. I married a Sierra Leonean. Okay. Well, anyway, that is still part of it. But in terms of the preservation of the culture, you see that decline because even the Agudas had to anglicize their names. Yeah. So the Martinez became Martins, Jorge became George. So they had to fit, as Alinta said.
And what was interesting is like they also because when they for example arrived in Lagos, and they had difficulties, so that's where they moved to other cities like Porto Novo, so they had difficulty to be accepted in Lagos, and I think that explains sometimes the difference in terms of. I was talking about how they are prominent. They were more prominent in what's known the Republic of Benin nowadays. They were more prominent in terms of like involving politics, not as much as from what I've read in Nigeria.
Yes. You're going to ask some questions, aren't you, Alinta?
Yeah, I just because I think it's an interesting discussion. Because my question is about how this story has been told to you. How did it been transmitted?
How has it been transmitted? Yes. What we found it later on was different families told different stories. Now, my story was also very complex as well because of that intermarriage. My great-grandmother was Andresa Muniz. Her daughter, who's my grandmother, married a Guinean from Ghana, so which made my mother doubly colonized as well. So, but she grew up, the good thing about it was because around that time, you also had the British presence, and a lot of the Ghanaians and educated, if you had some kind of education, you worked for the British government. It meant that families travelled around a lot. But my grandmother did not want to move her children around. So they were left in the care of my great-grandmother, Andresa Desmonis, in Lagos. So my great-grandmother actually raised my mother. So she was able to have that direct link with her. We had, and that was also a heavy Catholic presence, because God forbid her daughter, because the Catholics, were very, very, the Agudas. For them, it was also retaining their own identity as Catholics. So the insistence on a Catholic education meant that you had a lot of the Aguda families wanting a school for their children. So the Holy St. Mary's Lagos and Holy Child College Lagos was became the schools for the Aguda families as well. So the story of the Aguda that story became my mother's story. When her grandmother died, her legacy was to give the name to me. So I grew up with this name, a Ghanaian name and a Brazilian name in Nigeria. So I didn't fit into the national. So even at school, it was, where are you from? You're not Europe. I always had to question my identity. 1 minute you felt like a foreigner. The good thing about the Brazilian story was because they came with Yoruba. So Yoruba was a language that my mother grew up speaking. I grew up in Ibadan, and people say, how come you speak Yoruba? My Yoruba is absolutely, So the preservation was the language as well. So my mother grew up speaking English, Fanti, and Yoruba, because she was also sent to Ghana, because the Ghanaians also wanted to have their own identity. All the cultural, every culture wants to have the imprint on the children. So my mother was fortunate to go to Holy Child Lagos and Holy Child Ghana, but she also had the Yoruba as well, which we kind of had at home. Growing up, there was always this, your grandmother's from Brazil. The whole idea was, they didn't want to talk about slavery. So I think that was also because there was also that shame as well. So for a very long time, it was only we're from Brazil. Yes, we went on holiday to Brazil. We visited Brazil with my mother, but it was still never linked to slavery. I always knew that I would have to question the story, because it's just part of your DNA that you're going to have to question. I studied at Louisiana State University, and I realized that Americans were so entrenched in slave story, because to them that was part of their national identity as well. You can't suppress that history. There are ways through which you can talk about it without it being painful as well. There are ways that you can also preserve without being angry as well. You have to be trained to do that. Probably that's why I stopped looking at Nigeria first, and I went and looked at Senegal. Now that I'm a trained historian, I felt that it was time to go back and retell the story. I'm working, I'm working with 2 other historians. So there is some good news, okay? It's not all gloom and doom, in the sense that we have historians who are obviously of not African Brazilian, because sometimes it gets too close. They are looking at the history of Nigeria in itself, and once they start looking at the history in its entirety, the history of the Brazilian returnees always pops up. You can't ignore it. It's always there. So I was approached by one of the historians who knew my own background and said, we need to actually form a committee where we can now start looking at the project, so that at least that way we're coming in as because remember you talked about intellectuals in Republic of Benin. Now, as an intellectual, you can go in with a lot of what we call cultural knowledge, first-hand knowledge, because you also have the evidence, you've gathered your work, then people start taking you seriously, because that way they can understand why you're actually doing what you're doing. It's not capital's gain, it's not about the money, it's really about making sure that the national identity, that discourse that has been submerged and repressed, is actually fit, so you've got that story. Because the Aguda families are still present in Nigeria. I'm now in my first year of running the Nigerian Brazilian Oral History Project. I'm the project coordinator. I went back to Lagos, took off my family hat, put on my academic hat, spoke and called my family and actually sat them down and said, Mom, you're in your 80s. My friend did the calculation and said, you're the last generation that had anything to do with any living Brittany. If we don't talk to you right now, forget that history, wiped out. Well, my mother and her aunt and my aunts put on their gele. I didn't interview them because it would have been too close. I sent them off to the one of my colleagues, who is the head of the Department of History at the University of Ibadan. Olutayo Additional is head of history. He's our coordinator on the ground in Lagos, in Nigeria. I'm here in the UK, and we have Professor Olufemi Von, who is head of history at Amherst. We're Nigerians, we're academics, we're writers. We have a vested interest. We've started interviewing and recording people. It's kind of like a race for life, but we kind of hope that we would actually start working with the families on the ground. There's a lot of financial, compared to Benin, where it's intellectual, because of the British influence, and I would say that it's all about the what's in it for us. It's more capitalist driven. It's more about, right, okay, if I tell you my story, how much am I going to get? And I've been ignoring people, and I'm saying, you'll come back to me when you're ready, because at the end of the day, there are people who are going to come to us, and we would want to preserve this. It's for posterity. It's also about opening up opening up that tourist, so that at least people can come to Nigeria. People go to Nigeria a lot, but they go for business. If you are on a BA flight to Lagos and you find anybody who's not Nigerian, ask them, what are you going to do in Lagos? Business. They're not there for tourism. If you're on a flight coming from Paris to Lagos via Benin Republic, people are going on holiday, and they're taking money. They are actually going, on holiday to visit and look at the sites. In Lagos, people are going in to do business and they're out of Lagos because nobody wants to hang out in Nigeria, where the history actually started from. So what we're trying to do is, first of all, make sure that we have a good, clear idea. So I'm working with Alinta, because Alinta already has, the history as well, so that we can have a big, clear picture. Hopefully in another year or in another couple of months, the Nigerian Brazilian Public History Project's website will be up. We will start uploading the interviews that we've started doing. It's still a lot of work.
But I want to point out that still in Benin is complicated as well. It's not, obviously you have some initiative, but it's still really complicated because it's how you preserve those houses. If you think about even here, how to preserve, when you have to preserve buildings, it's a lot of money.
Yeah.
So the question of who can do that as well. That's why what this initiative to work with Brazil to train masons, carpenters, to send them back there, because obviously you have those houses over there, well, it's really important, but they are always initiative. But I still think that as in Nigeria, there is not there is no national agenda, because it comes from Porto Novo, it comes from the cities, it comes from the fact that we are WIDA, we can the local authorities, and I think one thing I was mentioned is like, for me, the lack of preservation. That's my direction with my research. Is it reflects the difficulty for I'm going to say West Africa, to deal with slavery, because to accept these communities, they are accepted because they live there, but what do they represent? Because they represent a really complex history. They are they were enslaved, and they went to Brazil. I mean, they were forced deported to Brazil, and then they managed to come back. But so even their history, because they were enslaved, and some of them took also part to the slave trade. So it shows all the complexity and layer of its history and how it's dealt with. So I think that's also the issue.